Hey guys, picture this. It's a scorching noon in Tenochtitlan, the sun beating down on a city built atop a swamp like a colossal water-logged Lego set, while chieftains in feathered headdresses argue over who gets to crush the next rival tribe's skulls. Yeah, the Aztecs didn't exactly win the Nice Neighbor award. Before we plunge into the blood-spattered brilliance of this warrior civilization, smash that like button if you love history with a side of dark humor, and drop a comment telling us which modern battlefield you face daily, traffic, anyone. Now dim the lights, grab a snack that isn't a human sacrifice, and settle in because you're about to wander through bustling markets scented with roasted maguey, hear the clatter of obsidian blades, and feel the oppressive drumbeat of conquest echoing like your mom's Wi-Fi router when it finally drops. Imagine you, a fresh minted Telatoni, trying to keep your empire together while juggling tribute taxes that would make even a tax accountant weep. Yeah, it's as chaotic as your inbox on a Monday. Let's unpack how a handful of fierce nomads turned a marshy island into the most feared empire north of the Andes. And stay tuned because the real story is messier, louder, and more mind-blowing than any Netflix drama could ever script. When the Mexica first set foot on the soggy slab of land that would become Tenochtitlan, the water smelled like a swampy soup of algae and rotting reeds. Chief Tenoch, whose beard was as wild as a jungle vine, declared the island a divine gift from the sun god Huitzilopochtli. He ordered his people to stake wooden posts into the mud, hammering them like a carpenter on a caffeine binge. Soon the reeds gave way to a lattice of causeways that glittered in the sunrise, as if the city were a giant floating board game. The Mexica laughed at the odds. Building a metropolis on a lake was the ultimate real estate hack. To keep their fledgling town from sinking, the Mexica forged uneasy alliances with the neighboring Tepanecs, who traded stone for fish and occasionally a good story. Together they hauled limestone blocks across the water on reed rafts, the scent of fresh fish mingling with dust and sweat. Women sang while pounding maize dough, their voices rising above the clatter of wooden mallets and the occasional splash of a startled otter. Even the gulls seemed to cheer, circling like paparazzi at a celebrity wedding. By night, the settlement glowed with torches, casting flickering shadows that turned the swamp into a stage for mythic drama. At the heart of the new city rose a towering shrine, its steps slick with rain and the oily perfume of burning copal incense. Here the Mexica offered blood-white jaguar skins to Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird feathered war god who demanded warriors as fierce as a video game boss. Priests drummed a rhythm that rattled the reeds, a beat so primal it could wake the dead, or at least the sleepy fishermen. The air vibrated with chants, the words tasting like copper and courage. When the sun slipped behind the volcanoes, the whole island seemed to pulse with a red glow, as if the god himself had lit a giant neon sign, "War is coming." Soon enough, neighboring tribes sniffed the incense and saw an opportunity for a raid, thinking the Mexica were soft as overcooked tamales. The first clash erupted on a misty dawn, swords clanging like kitchen knives on a steel pot, and the Mexica fought back with the ferocity of a cat on a laser pointer. Blood splattered the reeds, turning the water a sickly shade of burgundy that made even the fish gasp. Tenoch, perched on a makeshift throne of captured shields, shouted orders that cut through the chaos like a meme caption. By sunset, the attackers fled, their war cries muffled by the swamp's gurgling sighs, and the Mexica celebrated with a feast of roasted iguana and fermented cactus juice. The victory stitched a new thread into the Mexica's identity, binding them to a destiny of conquest and ceremony. Every sunrise now began with a drumbeat that sounded suspiciously like a modern alarm clock, jolting the city awake. Young boys practiced spear throws on the causeways, their laughter echoing off the water like mischievous sprites. The city swelled, its markets buzzing with traders shouting over the scent of spiced beans and the occasional waft of sewage. And so, from that soggy slab, a warrior civilization rose, ready to write its legend across the new world, one battle at a time. Picture the bustling market of Tenochtitlan, where the smell of roasted maguey sap mingles with the clamor of merchants shouting about turquoise and cacao. The Mexica, draped in feathered war cloaks, sent envoys to the lake-bound city of Texcoco, offering gifts that glittered like a Netflix opening credit sequence. Their words were slick, promising shared spoils and a united front against the ever-looming threat of the Tepeyac. Behind the polite smiles, however, the Mexica were plotting a power move that would make even Game of Thrones strategists raise an eyebrow. When the drums of war finally rolled across the shallow waters, the Mexica warriors charged like a herd of angry jaguars, their obsidian blades flashing in the sun. The battle at Lake Xochimilco roared with the clash of shields and the guttural cries of men and women alike, while the stench of blood and sweat hung heavy in the humid air. Against the seasoned Texcocan ranks, the Mexica's ferocity turned the tide, slicing through opposition with a precision that felt like a perfectly timed meme drop. Victory was sweet, but it also tasted of iron and ambition, setting the stage for a new political dance. In the aftermath, the three city-states, Mexico, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, sealed their pact with a ceremony that smelled of incense, fresh corn, and the faint tang of fear. They called it the Triple Alliance, a trio of power that would spread its influence like a wildfire across the valley, demanding tribute in the form of jade, maize, and occasionally a bewildered llama. Their banners rippled over newly conquered towns, and the sound of marching soldiers echoed like a heavy metal concert in the hills. Yet beneath the triumph, whispers of who's really in charge drifted through the night markets as each partner guarded its own crown jewels. Not everyone was thrilled about this new order. Dissent simmered in the back alleys of Tlatelolco, where disgruntled nobles muttered about losing their ancestral privileges. Meanwhile, the Tepeyac, still nursing a bruised ego, launched guerrilla raids that smelled of burning reeds and desperation. The alliance's leaders had to juggle internal squabbles while fending off external arrows, a juggling act that would make a circus performer break a sweat. Their council chambers filled with heated debates, the clatter of spears against stone punctuating every argument like an over-enthusiastic percussion solo. Despite the turmoil, the Triple Alliance pressed on, its resolve as stubborn as a cactus in a desert storm. They forged new roads, built towering temples that scraped the sky, and demanded tribute that filled their granaries to the brim, the scent of roasted maize drifting over the capital like a victory perfume. Each challenge, whether a rebel's whispered threat or a rival king's war cry, only sharpened their edge, proving that a coalition built on cunning and steel could survive the chaos. In the end, the empire's rise resembled a blockbuster saga. Dramatic, messy, and unforgettable, leaving a legacy that still echoes in the ruins of stone and the stories of modern storytellers. When the sun rose over the basalt cliffs of the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec warlords gathered their elite eagle and jaguar knights like a rock star lineup before a concert. The knights' feathered helmets glittered, their jaguar pelts rippled, and the air smelled of sweat, pine resin, and the faint sting of burning copal. With war drums thundering like a subway train, they set off on foot and on war canoes, their spears flashing like neon lights. The valley echoed with shouts, the clatter of wooden shields, and the occasional grunt of a startled armadillo. Even the cicadas seemed to pause, as if the whole world held its breath for the next move. First stop, the city-state of Texcoco, a proud rival that thought it could outwit the Aztecs with poetry and market stalls. The Eagle Knights swooped down, their war cries slicing through the morning mist, while the jaguars slipped through alleys like cats hunting a laser pointer. The conquered leaders were forced to kneel on cold stone, their faces flushed with fear and the sour taste of fermented pulque. Tribute gold, jade, and baskets of maize was piled high, the scent of fresh corn mixing with the acrid odor of blood from wounded defenders. The Aztecs laughed, a sound that rang like a bad karaoke night, as they loaded the loot onto waiting llamas and human porters. Word of the campaign spread faster than gossip at a royal banquet, and soon the Aztecs earned a reputation as the unstoppable force that could turn a city into a souvenir shop. Other polities whispered, better send tribute than become a footnote in their war story, as if the empire were a giant video game boss you'd rather pay to skip. The warlords strutted through conquered plazas, their sandals kicking up dust that smelled like old incense and fresh mud. Children clapped not out of admiration, but because the spectacle reminded them of fireworks, bright, loud, and a little terrifying. Even the gods seemed to smirk, watching the chaos unfold from their stone altars. Behind the glory, the logistics were messier than a kitchen after a taco fest. Caravans of tribute trudged through swampy paths, the air thick with the rot of overripe fruit and the pungent perfume of human waste, because nothing says power like a river of urine flowing past your camp. Soldiers marched with backs bent under the weight of gold plates, their muscles screaming louder than a rock band's amp. Nighttime brought the groans of exhausted porters and the occasional howl of a stray dog that had sniffed the blood-soaked earth. Yet the Aztecs kept marching, their morale fed by the sight of glittering spoils and the promise of the next feast. By the time the warlords returned to Tenochtitlan, the city's plazas were buzzing with traders hawking tribute goods like street vendors at a carnival. The smell of roasted maize mingled with incense, creating a heady perfume that declared, "We are the masters of this valley." The conquered city-states, now paying tribute, sent emissaries who bowed so low their noses brushed the dust, an irony not lost on the Aztecs, who loved a good punchline. The empire's coffers swelled, and with each new tribute, the Aztecs cemented their reputation as a militaristic juggernaut that could turn any opponent into a tax receipt. And so the legend of the Eagle and Jaguar Knights grew, echoing across the valley like a bass line that just won't quit. The sun sank behind the towering temples of Tenochtitlan, painting the lake's waters a bruised orange. From the distant horizon, the thin sails of Spanish galleons creaked like a bad karaoke version of a pirate anthem, their flags flapping like nervous birds. Inside the capital, whispers curled through the stone corridors, smelling of incense and the sour tang of fear. Discontented provinces, Texcoco, Tlacopan, and the restless borderlands, had begun to murmur about the empire's golden age, now cracked like a shattered obsidian mirror. And above it all, the great eagle of the Aztec banner cast a shadow that seemed to ask, could this warrior civilization still soar when foreign steel thundered toward its heart? The coalition of provinces met in a hidden cavern beneath the Chinampa farms, where the air was thick with the smell of fermented cacao and damp earth. Their leaders, draped in feathered cloaks, spoke in hushed tones, each word punctuated by the distant clang of Spanish swords being sharpened on distant docks. They argued that Montezuma's devotion to the gods had become a costly subscription to a myth that left their people starving, while the conquistadors feasted on plumed parrots and gold. A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd when one chieftain compared the Spaniards to the worst video game boss ever, unfair, overpowered, and impossible to dodge. Yet despite the humor, the scent of sweat and blood already lingered on their hands, a grim reminder that rebellion was a dish best served hot and messy. When the news reached Montezuma II, the emperor stood on his balcony, the wind tugging at his jade-inlaid cloak like a mischievous child. He stared down at the lake, where floating lilies released a faint perfume that clashed with the metallic bite of incoming cannon fire. "We will not let the eagle be clipped," he declared, his voice booming like a war drum, even as a nervous aide whispered that the Spaniards had more firepower than a fireworks show on New Year's Eve. He summoned his elite jaguar warriors, whose armor clinked with the sound of rain on stone, and ordered the sacred banners to be raised high, each feather catching the sun like a flash of neon. In the courtyard, cooks hurriedly prepared maize cakes, their buttery aroma battling the acrid scent of burning oil from the city's forges, fuel for both body and battle. The decisive clash erupted at the causeway, where the lake's mist rose like ghostly applause, and the ground trembled under the pounding of thousands of feet. Spanish steel sang a harsh, tinny note as it sliced through the air, meeting the jaguar-clad warriors' obsidian blades that glittered like midnight on a black mirror. The smell of sweat, blood, and charred maize filled the battlefield, while cries of "Viva el Aguila" mixed with the guttural shouts of conquistadors cursing their own misfortune. At one point, a Spanish horse reared, its rider flailing like a cartoon character in a slapstick chase, only to be trampled by a charging warrior whose war paint smeared like a modern graffiti tag. Yet amidst the chaos, a lone trumpeter from the Spanish side tried to rally his men with a tune that sounded suspiciously like "We Will Rock You," only to be drowned out by the thunderous roar of the Aztec war drums. As dusk settled, the battlefield lay strewn with broken spears, shattered shields, and the bitter scent of copper that clung to the night air. Montezuma, bloodied but unbowed, stood atop a mound of fallen enemies, his eyes reflecting the flickering torches like twin suns of defiance. The coalition's leaders, now bruised and humbled, realized that the empire's spirit was as stubborn as a cat refusing to take a bath. No amount of foreign pressure could wash it away entirely. Yet the Spanish, with their guns and greed, had already begun to rewrite the story, turning the once proud eagle into a cautionary footnote in a history book that would later be taught with a side of popcorn. In the end, the shadow of the eagle lingered, reminding us that even the mightiest warriors can be humbled, but their echo can still rattle the bones of future generations. The night the Spaniards finally breached Tenochtitlan's causeways, the city roared like a wounded jaguar, its canals churning with black water and the stench of burnt incense. Flaming arrows hissed over the stone walls, splashing into the lake with a sizzle that sounded like popcorn in a microwave. Aztec warriors, faces painted with the fierce red of bloodletting, clashed with steel and obsidian, their war cries echoing against the broken temples. Every step of the invaders was met with a chorus of drums, the rhythm beating like a heart that refused to stop, even as the sky turned a sickly orange from the fires. By dawn, the grand palace lay in ruins, and the once glittering city of 1,000,000 souls was reduced to ash and echo. When the smoke cleared, the survivors stumbled through the wreckage, their sandals squelching in mud mixed with blood and spilled chocolate. Yes, even the cacao vats were not spared. The Spanish conquistadors, dripping with sweat and triumph, surveyed their prize like kids in a candy store, unaware they had just unwrapped a bitter aftertaste. Families huddled in the shadows of collapsed pyramids, whispering prayers to gods that no longer answered, their voices trembling like a broken guitar string. Yet amidst the desolation, a stubborn resilience flickered. Mothers taught their children the ancient songs, and old warriors sharpened obsidian blades for no one but memory. The empire had fallen, but its spirit lingered like the sour aftertaste of too much tamarind. Even as the empire crumbled, its military genius refused to die with the stone arches. The Aztecs had invented the war dance, a coordinated flash mob of spears and shields that could outmaneuver any European phalanx, a tactic that would later inspire modern Mexican drill teams to this day. Their engineers had turned floating gardens into battle platforms, a concept that today's engineers joke about when designing amphibious vehicles. The legacy of the eagle and cactus banner still flutters over modern plazas, reminding citizens that strategy and swagger can coexist. In every Mexican soccer stadium, you can hear the echo of a war chant, especially when the home team scores a goal that feels like a victorious spear thrust. Religion, the beating heart of Aztec life, survived the siege in the most unexpected ways. The ritual of human sacrifice, once performed on stone altars, now lives on in the passionate fervor of Dia de los Muertos, where marigolds and sugar skulls replace obsidian knives, but the reverence for the dead stays intact. Artists still paint the fierce feathered serpents of Quetzalcoatl on murals, their colors as vivid as the sunrise over the old lake. The poetry of the codices, once hidden in temple vaults, now hangs in museums, their ink smelling faintly of rain on volcanic soil. Even the taste of chocolate, once a sacred beverage for warriors, has become a national obsession, reminding us that the past can be both bitter and sweet. Today, Mexico wears its Aztec heritage like a superhero costume, sometimes flashy, sometimes uncomfortable, but always unmistakable. Tourists snap selfies in front of the Templo Mayor, unaware they're standing on a battlefield where the air once crackled with the clash of obsidian blades and the scent of roasted maize. Politicians invoke the warrior spirit to rally crowds, often with the same swagger as in ancient Tlahtani, that's a ruler, not a taco. The story of the fallen empire is told in classrooms, movies, and even in the lyrics of reggaeton, proving that a civilization's echo can outlast its stone. In the end, the Aztecs remind us that even when a city falls, its heartbeat can still drum through the streets of modern Mexico, louder than any marching band at a fiesta. It was 1325 when Tenok, priest-king with a flair for drama, claimed the gods had sent him a billboard in the sky, an eagle perched on a prickly cactus, its beak clutching a writhing snake. The vision glittered like a neon sign over the murky waters of Lake Texcoco, and the tribe took it as a divine GPS coordinate. With a mix of reverence and a hint of smug satisfaction, Tenok rallied his people, promising a home where the heavens themselves had drawn the floor plan. They packed their bundles, sloshing through marshy mud that smelled of algae and old fish bones, and set sail toward the promised islands. Little did they know they were about to turn a soggy swamp into the world's first floating metropolis. When the canoes scraped the shallow islands, the first thing that greeted them was a chorus of squawking ducks and the slap-slap of reeds against hulls. Tenok ordered the men to drive wooden stakes deep into the lake bed, each thud echoing like a drumbeat of destiny. Women wove thick mats from cattail reeds, their fingers moving faster than a tick-tock dance, while the scent of fresh mud mixed with the sour tang of fermenting fish sauce filled the air. By night, flickering torches threw shadows on the water, turning the lake into a giant, shimmering disco ball. The modest dwellings that rose on those stakes were squat and leaky, but they smelled of hope, sweat, and the occasional waft of roasted maize. Life on the islands was a sensory overload. The constant hum of insects like tiny, winged critics, the slap of water against the wooden platforms, and the occasional splash of a startled fish. The children chased each other across reed bridges, their laughter ricocheting off the water like echoing maracas. The smell of wet earth mingled with the acrid bite of smoke from communal fires, where cooks tossed corn dough into the air, creating a cloud of sweet, toasted perfume. Even the occasional stench of rotting reeds, nature's version of a bad roommate, could not dampen the settlers' spirits. Tenok would often joke that if the gods wanted a perfect city, they'd have sent a blueprint instead of a cryptic bird and snake selfie. Storms soon tested the fledgling settlement, slamming waves against the wooden stakes as if the lake itself were auditioning for a disaster movie. Tenok's engineers responded with ingenuity, stacking logs like Lego bricks and sealing gaps with a mixture of mud, pine resin, and a dash of bravado. They fashioned canals that channeled water away, turning flood threats into bustling waterways for canoes. Think ancient Venice meets Avatar on a budget. The irony was delicious. A city built on water that would later dominate the land, all while the founders were still learning to keep their sandals from floating away. By the time the rains receded, the settlement looked less like a patchwork of huts and more like the opening scene of a grand epic, ready for the next chapter. Standing on the highest platform, Tenok surveyed the glittering expanse, feeling the wind tug at his feathered headdress like an eager audience. He imagined a future where traders from distant mountains would barter jade for cacao, and where the city's canals would echo with the clatter of stone-paved streets. The humble wooden stakes beneath his feet seemed to whisper, "We're just getting started." With a grin that could rival any modern superheroes, he declared that this lake-born settlement would rise to become the heart of an empire, Tenochtitlan, the city that turned water into gold. And so, the story of a visionary priest-king and a sky-written omen began, setting the stage for a saga that would outlast even the most binge-watched streaming series. When the first wooden huts sprouted on the swampy arms of Lake Texcoco, the Aztecs quickly learned that water was both a friend and a foe. Ingenious engineers hefted stone and timber to carve narrow canals, turning the lake into a watery grid of streets. Along the edges they piled mud, reeds, and compost into raised beds called chinampas, which floated like giant lettuce rafts and fed a growing crowd of hungry warriors. The air smelled of fresh corn, wet earth, and the occasional whiff of fish guts, an aromatic reminder that dinner was never far away. By sunset, canoes sliced through mirrored water, their paddles splashing like applause for the city's relentless expansion. But a city cannot thrive on rice cakes alone. It needed tribute, and that meant courting the neighboring Altapetal like a charismatic diplomat at a royal banquet. The Mexica sent emissaries bearing cacao and jade, promising protection in exchange for maize, obsidian, and the occasional war prize. Alliances blossomed, and tribute caravans rolled across causeways, their carts rattling like a rock band on tour. Yet every gift came with a price tag of loyalty, and the Aztecs learned to smile while counting the shiny shells hidden in the cargo. It was a political dance where one misstep could drown the whole partnership, literally, if the lake decided to rise. Sure enough, the lake was a fickle partner, swelling each rainy season as if it were auditioning for a role as a monster in a myth. The Aztecs responded by stitching together massive causeways, stone ribbons that stretched like giant stepping stones across the water. They erected dikes, low walls of packed earth and reeds, to hold back the encroaching tide, and reinforced them with bundles of cattail that smelled like a swampy perfume. Laborers sang shanties while hauling stones, their voices echoing off the water like a chorus of determined hipsters. Each new structure tested the city's resolve, turning engineering into a high-stakes game of who can outbuild the lake. The work was gritty, mud clung to skin like stubborn lipstick, and the smell of rotting algae made even the bravest warriors wrinkle their noses. Night watches were haunted by the croak of frogs and the distant howl of a lone otter, a soundtrack that reminded everyone that nature still called the shots. Workers slipped on slick reeds, sometimes landing face first in water so cold it felt like a plunge into a frozen margarita. Yet every splash was a badge of honor, proof that the city's heart beat beneath the surface. Even the insects seemed to applaud, buzzing in clouds that glittered like tiny fireworks over the canals. By the time the sun rose over the gleaming causeways, Tenochtitlan stood like a floating metropolis straight out of a sci-fi epic. Think Avatar meets ancient Maya, only with more chocolate and less blue skin. The Aztecs had turned a fickle lake into a partner, not a predator, proving that ingenuity can outswim even the most stubborn flood. Their chinampas stretched like green carpets, feeding armies that would later march to conquer distant lands. And as the water lapped against the stone arches, the city's leaders toasted with pulque, smiling at the irony that the very thing that threatened them had become their greatest triumph. In the end, rising waters raised not only the lake, but also the legend of a capital that refused to sink. The sunrise over Lake Texcoco painted the reed-strewn waters with molten gold, but the glitter was a thin veneer over a brewing storm. From the wooden causeways, the scent of damp mud and fish-scale incense rose like a warning breath. Ambitious warlords from Tlacopan and Texcoco strutted into the city gates, their feathered helmets flashing like Hollywood superhero capes. They barked demands for submission, slamming their war clubs on the stone plazas with a thud that rattled the market stalls. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, felt the first tremor of a rivalry that would soon crack its foundations. In response, the city's elite warriors gathered, their obsidian blades humming like electric guitars at a rock concert. They launched brutal campaigns across the lake's islands, scattering enemies like startled frogs in a pond. The sound of war cries mingled with the splash of canoes, and the air grew thick with the iron tang of blood and the sour stink of burnt maize. Villages that once offered tribute now burned, their thatched roofs curling into blackened curls of smoke that rose like angry eyebrows. Each victory was cheered with a grim relish, as if the gods themselves were watching a particularly violent episode of a reality show. Back within the city's bustling markets, commoners whispered beneath the shade of cacao trees, their faces smeared with the grime of daily toil. They muttered about the ever-growing tribute demands, comparing the weight of gold to a sack of overripe avocados that would never fit in their tiny homes. The baker's wife spat out a piece of stale tortilla, declaring, "If they want more tribute, they can take my husband's cooking. He's already a disaster." The murmurs swelled into a low rumble, like distant thunder warning of a storm. Even the city's children, playing with reed toys, paused to stare at the empty plates, wondering when the next levy would arrive. High atop the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the priesthood gathered under a sky bruised with ominous clouds, their robes rustling like old parchment. The high priest lifted his chin, pointing at a comet streaking across the heavens, quipping, "Looks like someone left the cosmic pizza oven on again." He declared the celestial omen a warning, interpreting the fiery tale as a sign that the gods were displeased with the city's greed. The incense burners sputtered, releasing a sweet, choking smoke that made the air feel like a dense, sugary fog. The priest's solemn chants echoed through the stone corridors, each note a reminder that divine patience was thinner than a tortilla chip. By the time the moon rose, casting a silver sheen over the lake's restless surface, Tenochtitlan stood on the brink of war like a nervous cat perched on a rooftop. The clang of armor, the hiss of angry crowds, and the distant boom of war drums formed a chaotic symphony that made even the most stoic warriors twitch. Citizens clutched their loved ones tighter, feeling the city's pulse throb like a massive drumbeat in a stadium. Yet beneath the tension, a flicker of defiant humor survived. Someone whispered that if the warlords wanted a showdown, they should at least bring popcorn. The night air vibrated with anticipation, and the capital braced itself for the storm of rivals that threatened to wash away everything but its stubborn heart. At the peak of its glory, Tenochtitlan floated like a jeweled spiderweb across the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco. Its canals sang with the splash of canoes, markets buzzed with the clamor of merchants hawking cacao and obsidian, and the towering temples glittered under the sun like giant crystal skyscrapers. The city's heart pulsed to the rhythm of drums, incense, and the occasional laugh of a child chasing a rainbow-colored butterfly. Even the distant hills seemed to bow, as if the whole world had been invited to a grand fiesta. Yet beneath the glittering facade, a storm brewed that no priest could read in the stars. In 1519, a ragtag band of Spaniards, led by the swaggering Hernan Cortés, sliced through the jungle like a badly edited Hollywood sequel. Their armor clanged like a marching band, and their swords shone brighter than any Aztec jade, until the first wave of European disease slipped through their boots, turning the city's vibrant streets into a silent, coughing graveyard. The Aztecs stared at the newcomers, bewildered by men who rode horses that seemed to float over the mud. Cortés flashed a grin that said, "We come in peace and also bring plagues," while his men whispered about gold like it were the ultimate loot box. The air grew thick with the scent of fear, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood that would soon stain the water. The Aztec warriors gathered on the main causeway, a stone-lined ribbon that stretched like a runway into the heart of the city, brandishing spears that glittered like the teeth of a dragon. They hurled obsidian blades and shouted war cries that rattled the lake's surface, while Spanish muskets cracked with a sound that reminded everyone of fireworks on the 4th of July, only far less festive. The battle turned into a chaotic dance, a macabre tango where men slipped on algae, fell into the water, and emerged gasping like actors who missed their cue. Every splash echoed the desperate heartbeat of a civilization fighting for its last breath. Iron clanged against stone, and the causeway became a river of mud, blood, and the occasional bewildered parrot squawking, "Ay, caramba." As the fight roared on, the great temples, Tlaloc's range shrine, and the sun god's towering pyramid, caught fire, their stone faces glowing orange like giant marshmallows left too long over a campfire. Flames licked the night sky, sending plumes of black smoke that smelled of burnt incense, charred wood, and the unmistakable stink of melted gold. The heat pressed against faces, turning breath into steam, while the cries of priests chanting for rain turned into desperate pleas for mercy. Below, the lake boiled with the reflection of the inferno, turning the water into a mirror of molten chaos. Even the Spanish, hardened by conquest, paused to stare, as if watching a Netflix drama that had finally reached its dramatic climax. The sunstone, that massive calendar disk, lay at the center of the turmoil, its intricate carvings now smeared with ash and the blood of heroes, an ironic reminder that even the gods can't stop a bad sequel. With the temples reduced to crumbling ruins, the city's soul seemed to flicker like a dying candle in a hurricane, yet the Aztecs fought on, their spirits as stubborn as a cat refusing to take a bath. Finally, the Spanish breached the inner courtyard, their swords flashing like the lights of a sci-fi spaceship landing on an ancient altar. The last echo of a war drum faded into a hollow silence, broken only by the distant splash of a canoe capsizing under the weight of grief. Tenochtitlan's rise had been a towering saga, and its fall, a tragic finale that still haunts the lake's misty mornings like a ghostly encore. After the Spanish cannon fell silent, the stone skeleton of Tenochtitlan lay shattered. Soldiers and laborers hauled away broken obsidian and rotting timber, making room for a new grid of streets. Where once canoes sliced through turquoise water, bulldozers now churned mud into concrete. The newborn Mexico City rose like a phoenix with a hard hat, but the ghost of the lake still whispered in every wind. Even the pigeons seemed to mourn, cooing over the damp earth where floating gardens once swayed. Imagine stepping into a market where the scent of fresh corn mingles with the sour tang of algae. That was daily life on the Chinampas. Farmers paddled wooden rafts, their hands slick with mud, to tend tiny islands that floated like lettuce leaves on a giant salad bowl. The water sang a constant murmur, punctuated by the splash of a child chasing a stray iguana, while the sun turned the surface into a glittering mirror. When a storm rolled in, the canals turned into roaring rivers, and the city's foundations shivered like a drumbeat in a heavy metal concert. Yet the people laughed, slipping on slick stones and shouting, "Viva el agua," as if to prove the lake could not drown their spirit. Above the ruins, a golden eagle perched on a cactus, its beak clutching a serpent, became the ultimate selfie stick for the nation. Artists painted the bird on everything from cathedral ceilings to taco truck decals, turning myth into everyday branding. Children traced its silhouette on dusty sidewalks, feeling the wind ruffle their hair like the feathers of the legendary predator. Even street musicians, with battered guitars, strummed tunes that mimicked the eagle's cry, a high-pitched wail that cut through traffic noise. The emblem fluttered on flags, on jerseys, on memes, proof that a symbol can outlast stone, steel, and even a bad Wi-Fi connection. Spanish, Nahuatl, and a splash of modern slang now dance together in Mexican Spanish, each word a ripple from the lake's old tongue. When a tourist asks for tacos al pastor, the vendor might answer with a grin, "Con salsa de historia," a reminder that flavor carries memory. In movies, you'll see a hero sprinting across a flooded subway, a nod to the ancient causeways that once linked islands like a giant Lego set. The city's graffiti tags blend Aztec glyphs with emojis, a mashup that would make a Renaissance painter raise an eyebrow. And every time someone whispers, "Andale," you can almost hear the echo of canoes pushing against the current, urging you forward. Today, skyscrapers pierce the sky where temple towers once rose, but the foundations still drink from the same underground aquifer. Engineers marvel at how the Aztecs turned soggy mud into fertile farms, a feat that would make a modern urban planner blush. Walking through the historic center, you can feel the pulse of water beneath your feet, a reminder that the city is still afloat in spirit. The legacy of Tenochtitlan floats on in festivals, in the scent of blooming lilies, and in the stubborn grin of a people who turned a lake into a metropolis. So raise a glass of mezcal, listen to the distant lapping of a forgotten lake, and salute the floating city that proved humanity can build wonders on water and still have a good time doing it. The sunrise spilled molten gold over the canals of Tenochtitlan, turning the city's stone streets into glittering ribbons. In the grand courtyard of the Temple of the Sun, priest King Huitzilihuatl stood like a living calendar, his feathered headdress catching the light. He beckoned the shy apprentice Xochitl, whose eyes sparkled with the same curiosity that drives a cat into a forbidden pantry. "Listen, child," he said, voice booming over the clamor of merchants and drumbeats. "The gods are not distant statues. They are the pulse that makes this empire thrum." The crowd's chatter swelled like a restless river, and the apprentice felt the weight of centuries settle on her shoulders. Huitzilihuatl began with Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird warrior who chased night's shadows across the sky, a deity as fierce as a superhero with a sun-blazing cape. He painted the god's legend with vivid strokes. A mother sky who birthed him, a jealous moon that tried to swallow his light, and a legion of feathered serpents that whispered warnings. Xochitl giggled when the priest compared the god's hunger for warriors to a teenager's appetite for pizza, noting the irony of a sun that never stops eating. The priest chuckled, reminding her that even the mightiest deity needs tribute, just as a Netflix binge needs popcorn. Around them, incense curled like lazy dragons, and the scent of copal mingled with the salty breeze from the lake. As the city prepared for Tlaxcamacco, every alleyway turned into a stage for frantic artisans, stitching bright feathers onto costumes that would later flutter like fireworks. Vendors hawked roasted maize, spiced chocolate, and the occasional special meat that made the onlookers' stomachs do a nervous tap dance. Children chased each other with marigold garlands, their laughter ringing louder than the temple bells that warned of the impending sacrifice. The air grew thick with the sweet perfume of blooming bougainvillea and the acrid tang of burnt offering pits, a cocktail that could make a stoic warrior sneeze. Even the city's resident iguanas seemed to don tiny ceremonial necklaces, as if they, too, were auditioning for the grand show. When the day of the festival arrived, the plaza filled with a sea of jade green and blood-red banners that fluttered like nervous birds. The chosen captive, a warrior from a rival tribe, stood on the stone altar, his eyes blazing with the same defiant fire that Huitzilopochtli craved. With a swift, ceremonial slice, the priest-king's blade sang a grim lullaby, and the crowd inhaled the coppery perfume of fresh blood as if it were perfume. The sun rose higher, drinking the offering with a hunger that made even a Marvel villain look like a picky eater. Yet amidst the gore, a strange humor lingered. People whispered that the sun's favorite snack was extra crispy, and a child shouted, "Do we get a side of guacamole?" As the sun's rays stretched across the lake, the city seemed to exhale, its heart beating in sync with the celestial drum. Xochitl felt the power of the ritual thrumming through her veins, a mix of reverence and the strange thrill of being part of a story older than any Netflix series. The priest-king placed a fresh blossom on her forehead, declaring her a keeper of the sun's secret, and the crowd erupted in cheers louder than a stadium wave. The day's darkness receded, leaving behind a lingering scent of incense and the faint echo of drums, promising that tomorrow's sunrise would be just as dramatic. And so, under the watchful eye of Huitzilopochtli, the city marched onward, its people forever dancing on the razor edge between devotion and deliciously dark irony. The sky bruised to a deep violet, and a sudden famine turned the market stalls into ghost towns, the scent of rotting maize hanging like a bad perfume. Farmers muttered curses, while the wind carried the hollow howl of a distant jaguar, as if nature itself had hit the mute button. In the grand palace, High Priest Tezcatl, whose beard smelled of incense and old socks, swept his obsidian staff across the stone floor. He declared the omens were not mere weather glitches, but the gods' angry text messages. The empire shivered, awaiting his next command like a crowd before a surprise season finale. With a voice that crackled like firewood, the priest ordered a series of arduous quests, insisting that only blood and jade could appease the offended deities. He pointed a trembling finger at Xochitl, the warrior whose tattoos glowed like neon graffiti, and her cohort of battle-hardened sisters. "You will fetch the sacred jade from the Sun Temple and bring back a worthy victim from the rival city," he intoned, as if assigning a group project in a history class. The warriors exchanged skeptical glances, half expecting a coupon for free corn, yet the promise of averting disaster tasted sweeter than any sacrificial stew. Xochitl marched north, the heat beating her back like a relentless drum solo, while the scent of baked earth rose from the path. The jungle greeted them with a chorus of cicadas that sounded suspiciously like a 90s boy band rehearsal, and the river's slime clung to their boots. After 3 days of climbing sheer cliffs slick with rain-kissed moss, they reached the Sun Temple, its walls covered in jade mosaics that glittered like a celebrity's Instagram feed. Inside, a priestess guarded a jade mask that pulsed with a faint green glow, humming a tune that reminded Xochitl of a broken music box. With a swift, reverent grab, they seized the jade, feeling its cool weight like a promise of redemption. Next, the band slipped into the rival city of Tlacopan under a moon that looked like a half-eaten cheese wheel, its light casting long, mischievous shadows. The streets reeked of spilled ale and burnt incense, and a distant drumbeat thumped like a bad karaoke track. They hunted for a captive noble, a gaunt man whose eyes flickered with the terror of a sitcom character realizing he'd missed his cue. After a tense standoff, Xochitl offered him a choice. Walk to the altar as a sacrificial hero, or become the Empire's next rumor. He chose the former, stepping forward with a sigh that sounded oddly like a sigh from a tired superhero after a battle. Back at the capital, the jade was set upon the altar, its surface catching the torchlight and throwing emerald shards across the stone floor like confetti at a twisted wedding. The sacrificial victim was bound, his breath a mix of fear and the metallic tang of blood, while the crowd chanted in unison, their voices rising like a karaoke bar at midnight. As the priest raised the ceremonial blade, a sudden gust extinguished the flames, and the sky briefly turned a shade of pink, nature's way of saying plot twist, prompting a nervous chuckle from the onlookers. The gods, it seemed, accepted the offering, for the famine lifted the next dawn, and the corn sprouted like a green carpet. Xochitl smiled, half triumph, half relief, knowing she'd just survived a chapter that could rival any binge-worthy streaming saga. Xochitl slashed through the emerald chaos of the jungle, her machete singing like a bad karaoke night in a rainforest bar. The air throbbed with cicada choruses and the sour stink of rot, while shafts of sunlight stabbed the canopy like paparazzi flashes. Her companions, Teku, a hulking warrior with a scar shaped like a lightning bolt, and Izel, a shy healer who whispered to mushrooms, matched her stride, each step a drumbeat toward destiny. Behind them, the river gurgled a warning, spitting up foam that smelled like burnt sugar and fear. They all knew the sacred mountain of Coatepec waited, perched like a jagged crown over the world they were about to remake. Suddenly, a pack of snarling jaguars lunged from the shadows, their amber eyes glittering like cheap sequins on a costume party. Xochitl ducked, feeling the animal's hot breath on her neck, and shouted a battle cry that sounded suspiciously like a modern rock anthem. Teku swung his obsidian club, cracking the air and sending a jaguar sprawling into a thicket of thorns that hissed like an angry chorus line. Zizzle, trembling, tried to calm the beasts with a whispered prayer to the rain god, only to be shushed by a rustling vine that seemed to mutter, "Not today, healer." The encounter left them bruised, breathless, and questioning whether the gods had a sense of humor or a very cruel taste for drama. As they pressed on, the jungle itself seemed to breathe the old myths, spilling stories of how the world was baked in a cosmic oven by the gods Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca. A rusted stone altar, half swallowed by vines, whispered the tale of how the first humans were fashioned from maize dough, and then offered as blood-soaked candles to keep the sun from yawning away. Xochitl recalled the legend that every drop of blood spilled on the earth is a stitch in the celestial quilt, keeping the heavens from unraveling like an overcooked sweater. The group paused, the scent of damp earth mixing with the metallic tang of imagined sacrifice, and wondered if their own veins would soon become the universe's Wi-Fi password. A cicada chirped a rhythm that sounded oddly like a metronome, ticking down to the moment when flesh would meet stone. At last the silhouette of Kodapek rose, its peak cloaked in clouds that smelled like incense and wet stone, like a giant incense stick left out after a festival. The path narrowed to a precarious ledge where the wind howled like a bored teenager scrolling through memes. Xochitl felt the weight of the ritual pressing on her shoulders, heavier than a sack of jaguar pelts, and she wondered if the gods would appreciate her offering or just post a sarcastic comment on the celestial forum. Teku muttered a prayer to Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird warrior god, while Isil clutched a bundle of herbs that reeked of rosemary and desperation. Their laughter, nervous and raw, echoed off the stone, a reminder that even in the gravest of moments, humans can still crack a joke about their own melodrama. When they finally reached the summit, the sky opened like a theater curtain, spilling a blinding light that made Xochitl squint as if a giant spotlight had been switched on for the final act. The altar, a massive slab of basalt etched with serpentine glyphs, waited for the offering, its surface slick with rain and the faint scent of ozone. With a steady hand, Xochitl raised her ceremonial blade, its edge catching the sun like a lightsaber in a low-budget sci-fi flick, and whispered, "May our blood keep the world from glitching out." The first cut sang, and crimson sprayed onto the stone, sizzling and smoking as if the cosmos itself had taken a deep, satisfied breath. As the blood seeped into the cracks, the mountain seemed to pulse, and a distant rumble hinted that the gods, perhaps amused, had indeed received their subscription payment for another cycle of sunrise. At the stone-crowned summit, the wind howled like a restless spirit, rattling the obsidian torches that lined the platform. The captured noble, draped in silks that smelled of jasmine and fear, was hoisted onto the altar with a grunt and a sigh from the stone-baked priests. Their chants rose in a low, rhythmic hum, echoing off the cliffs as if the mountains themselves were humming a warning. Below, the crowd's murmurs swelled into a restless tide, each face lit by flickering firelight and nervous anticipation. Xochitl, clutching a woven basket of maize, felt the ground tremble under the weight of destiny, and a stray beetle's buzz on her ear. When the priestess raised the ceremonial blade, a hush fell thicker than the night's incense smoke, and the noble's eyes widened in a mix of terror and bewildered awe. The blade sang a sharp, metallic note as it sliced through flesh, and a gush of warm, copper-red blood sprayed like a macabre paint splash across the altar stones. Xochitl's stomach churned, tasting iron and the sour tang of fear, while a stray monkey on the fringe chattered, as if critiquing the performance. The heart, still beating a frantic drum, thumped against the priest's palm, its rhythm matching the drum beats of the chanting crowd. In that grotesque ballet, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath like a Netflix binge watcher waiting for the next plot twist. With reverent hands, the priest lifted the still pulsing heart toward the sky, shouting Huitzilopochtli's name louder than a stadium announcer at a championship game. The sun, perched like a golden eye, flared suddenly, spilling molten amber that painted the clouds in fiery strokes. Heat licked the faces of the onlookers, making sweat bead on brows and melt the wax of the torches into rivulets of gold. A crackle of celestial fire crackled, as if the heavens had just been rebooted, and the scent of ozone mingled with the earthy perfume of fresh rain. The heart's sacrifice seemed to power the sun's sudden outburst, a cosmic power up worthy of any superhero origin story. The sky blazed in a brief, blinding tableau, turning the world into a living fresco of reds, oranges, and a dash of electric blue that would make a Pixar sunrise jealous. Birds scattered, their wings slapping the heated air like frantic applause, while the crowd gasped, their chests swelling with a mix of dread and exhilaration. The priests swayed, their robes fluttering like flags in a victory parade, proclaiming the renewal of the world as if they'd just hit the reset button on existence. In that incandescent moment, the cosmic balance tipped back into place, a perfect equilibrium as delicate as a tightrope walker on a sunrise. Even the stone statues seemed to grin, their stone eyes glittering with a mischievous, timeless irony. When the fire dimmed, a hushed reverence settled over the summit, broken only by the occasional grunt of a tired warrior and the distant call of a lone hawk. Xochitl lowered her basket, feeling the weight of the ritual settle like a heavy cloak on her shoulders, yet a spark of fierce pride flickered within her chest. She thought of the noble's fate, half laughing at the absurdity that a single heart could keep the sun from taking a day off, like a cosmic coffee break denied. The crowd dispersed, their footsteps echoing like the credits rolling after an epic saga, each person carrying a piece of that blazing story home. And somewhere, high above, Huitzilopochtli winked, perhaps amused that mortals still needed drama to keep the universe humming. The first rays of a fierce new sun slashed the morning mist over Tenochtitlan, painting the stone temples in molten gold. After months of gnawing hunger, the markets burst with corn husks that smelled of sweet smoke and fresh rain, and the air vibrated with drums that could wake a sloth. Women in brightly woven huipils twirled, their skirts flashing like fireworks, while old men chuckled. We finally got the sequel to the famine return of the harvest. The city's canals reflected the celebration like a giant, glittering mirror, and even the gulls seemed to cheer, squawking in rhythm. Somewhere in the crowd, a child whispered that the sun must have taken a protein shake. Xochitl stood on the high platform, her priestess robes rustling like parchment in a desert wind, and surveyed the revelry with eyes that had seen too many sunrise sacrifices. She remembered the first time she offered a heart, still warm, still beating, while the crowd sang a chant that sounded suspiciously like a karaoke version of "We Will Rock You." Now seasoned and scarred, she felt the weight of centuries pressing against her shoulders, as solid as a stone altar. The scent of incense mingled with the tang of fresh maize, creating a perfume that could make a god swoon or a mortal gag. She smiled, half amused, half grim, at the irony that her youthful idealism had been replaced by a pragmatic reverence for blood and fire. The Aztecs believed that humanity's blood was the fuel that kept the heavens from sputtering, a cosmic gasoline that made the sun roar louder each day. Every sacrifice was a theatrical performance, a gruesome ballet where the victim's chest was opened like a present, and the heart was offered with a flourish that would make a magician jealous. The crowd gasped, the priests chanted, and the sky seemed to pulse brighter, as if the gods were taking a sip of the most potent red wine. Ironically, the very act that terrified outsiders also stitched the community together, like a macabre glue that held families, farms, and festivals in one bloody tapestry. Even the jaguar warriors, who prowled the night, joked that they'd rather die on an altar than be trampled by a bureaucratic tax collector. As the night deepened, Xochitl gathered the apprentices, kids with wide eyes and sticky hands from the feast, and whispered the promise that the rites would outlive them all. She taught them how to grind copal resin into powder that smelled like burnt caramel, and how to carve obsidian blades that sang when they struck stone. The children giggled, pretending the blades were lightsabers, while the elders rolled their eyes, muttering that the Empire's future was as certain as the next sunrise. Yet beneath the jokes, a solemn oath echoed. The blood of tomorrow's generations would keep the sun from dimming, a pact as unbreakable as a volcanic rock. The firelight flickered on their faces, casting shadows that danced like ancient spirits doing the Macarena. When the final drumbeat faded, the city exhaled a collective sigh that tasted of sweat, smoke, and triumph, as if the world itself had just hit the refresh button. Xochitl lifted her arms, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, and declared that the cycle of death and renewal would continue, like a Netflix series that never cancels. The echo of the sun's renewed vigor rang through the plazas, promising more harvests, more feasts, and more chances to watch the younger folk stumble over ceremonial steps. In the quiet after the fireworks, she heard the distant call of a lone quetzal, its feathers a flash of emerald that seemed to wink, "See you in the next chapter, priestess." And with that, she turned toward the altar, ready to write the next verse in the blood-stained saga of the gods. In early spring of 1519, the creaking hulls of Cortés' caravels sliced through the turquoise gulf, spilling a cloud of salty spray over the unsuspecting shoreline. The men, armed with steel swords that glinted like teeth and helmets that clanged louder than a marching band, stepped onto the sand of Veracruz, their boots sinking into wet, mud-caked earth. The air tasted of roasted fish and the sour tang of river water, while distant drums thumped like a heart in a fevered dream. A nervous clerk whispered that they had stumbled upon a new world, as if it were a video game level unlocked without a tutorial. Little did they know, the real boss battle was waiting just inland. Veracruz buzzed with market stalls where merchants hawked jade beads, cacao beans, and the most pungent fermented fish known to man. Its odor could knock a horse off its hooves. The Spaniards, eyes wide as saucers, bartered their glittering trinkets for gold doubloons, while the locals eyed their horses as if they were oversized, snorting unicorns. A chorus of languages collided, the sharp click of Spanish tongues meeting the melodic Nahuatl, creating a linguistic mash-up that would make any subtitle editor weep. A drunken tavern keeper offered Cortés a drink so strong it could have powered a cannon, and the conquistador grimaced, thinking, "This is not the wine I ordered." The port's chaos felt like a carnival where everyone wore a different mask, and the Spanish were the bewildered guests who had missed the invitation. After a week of feasting, squabbling, and a brief, ill-fated attempt to ride a native horse, which ended in a spectacular tumble, Cortés ordered his men inland, following a winding river that smelled of mud and fresh pine. The jungle pressed in on both sides, dripping with humidity that clung to skin like a clingy ex-partner, while insects sang a high-pitched symphony that could drown out any bard's lute. Along the dusty trail, they encountered Aztec envoys, tall, feather-adorned warriors whose armor shone with turquoise and gold, looking like living Instagram filters. The Spaniards offered gifts of glass beads and crossbows, which the Aztecs examined with a mix of curiosity and the kind of suspicion you reserve for a cat eyeing a laser pointer. A tense silence settled, broken only by the distant roar of waterfalls that hinted at a city of unimaginable scale. When the expedition finally beheld Tenochtitlan, the city rose from the lake like a floating citadel, its causeways shimmering with reflected sunrise, and its temples piercing the sky with stone spires that seemed to whisper, "Welcome, strangers to our Netflix binge of destiny." Moctezuma II, draped in a cloak of jade and gold that glittered like a superhero's cape, stepped forward with a court of advisors whose faces were a mosaic of awe, fear, and the occasional smirk, perhaps at the sight of a man in armor that looked like a medieval cosplay. The air was thick with incense, roasted corn, and the metallic scent of fresh blood from recent sacrifices, making the Spaniards' stomachs churn like a poorly tuned accordion. Moctezuma greeted Cortés with a lavish banquet, serving dishes that oozed with chilly heat hot enough to make a dragon sweat, while the Spaniards whispered about civilizing missions, as if they were about to hand out pamphlets on modern hygiene. The encounter crackled with irony. Two empires, each convinced they were the protagonists of a grand saga, now faced each other like rival streaming services fighting for the same subscriber base. The first night in the capital, the Spaniards huddled around a fire that crackled like a gossip column, swapping stories of home, while the distant echo of temple drums sounded like a warning siren. Moctezuma's courtiers watched them with narrowed eyes, noting the foreign smell of gunpowder that lingered like a bad aftershave. Both sides sensed the fragile balance, a delicate dance where one misstep could spill blood like a spilled jar of salsa. Yet beneath the formalities, a subtle humor lingered. The Spanish, who once thought they were the ultimate conquerors, now found themselves humbled by a city that floated on water and boasted more gold than a pirate's loot. As the moon rose over the lake, the stage was set for a clash of civilizations that would echo through history like a badly dubbed superhero movie, epic, messy, and impossibly dramatic. When Hernán Cortés first set foot on the jagged hills of Tlaxcala, the air smelled of burnt maize and the distant echo of war drums. The Tlaxcalans, still nursing fresh wounds from a recent Aztec raid, stared at the Spaniards with a mix of suspicion and hungry curiosity. Cortés, swaying his sword like a charismatic rock star, offered them iron swords and the promise of revenge against their relentless foe. The Tlaxcalan chiefs, who had been forced to eat the bitter roots of defeat, saw a chance to turn the tables and signed an alliance that would make history tremble. In that moment, the clash of civilizations took on a new flavor, spiced with ambition, mistrust, and a dash of opportunistic bravado. The Tlaxcalan Council gathered in a smoky cavern, their faces lit by flickering torches that threw grotesque shadows on stone walls. They argued over the Spaniards' strange armor, which clanged louder than a marching band at a birthday party, and the glittering gold coins that smelled faintly of copper and ambition. Yet the memory of Aztec soldiers trampling their fields like a herd of angry elephants kept their resolve firm. They negotiated terms with the sharp tongue of a seasoned negotiator, demanding that the Spaniards fight side by side, share spoils, and never betray them for a bowl of cacao. When the ink dried on the pact, Tlaxcala's war cry rose like a thunderclap, echoing across the valleys and sending a clear message to Tenochtitlan. The game had changed. Back in the glittering capital of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma sat on his jade-inlaid throne, his mind a storm of incense-laden reverence and gnawing doubt. Courtiers whispered that the newcomers were gods, their beards like tangled vines and their eyes burning with a strange fire, while others muttered that they were just badly dressed conquistadors with a nasty habit of stealing gold. The emperor's heart thumped like a drum in a ceremonial parade, torn between the ancient prophecy of feathered serpents and the practical fear of a foreign army that smelled of salt and gunpowder. He consulted his most trusted priests, who read the omens in the flight of hummingbirds and the ripples of the lake, each sign more confusing than the last. In the end, Moctezuma chose a path as delicate as walking on a lotus leaf. He would invite the Spaniards into his city, hoping hospitality would tame their hunger. The day the Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan, the city erupted in a cacophony of sounds. Market vendors shouting over the clatter of pottery, children laughing as they chased the dust kicked up by armored boots, and the low, mournful chant of priests praying to gods who might now be jealous. The Spaniards marched through canals on wooden rafts, their swords glinting like the teeth of a shark, while the scent of fresh fish mingled with the acrid tang of sweat and incense. Moctezuma greeted them in his palace, offering a feast of tamales, cacao, and a bewildering array of exotic fruits that looked like something out of a fantasy video game. The emperor's courtiers watched with wide eyes as the Spaniards tasted the food, their faces contorting between delight and disgust at the unfamiliar flavors. Yet beneath the ceremonial smiles, a palpable tension crackled like static, as each side wondered whether the other was a guest, a threat, or a future footnote in a story of conquest. The alliance with Tlaxcala and the uneasy hospitality in Tenochtitlan set the stage for a drama that would make Shakespeare blush. Spaniards, now armed with native allies and a growing appetite for gold, prowled the streets like wolves in a meat market, while the Aztec elite tried to keep their composure, polishing jade masks as if they could polish away impending doom. Ironically, the very hospitality Moctezuma offered, wine, music, and a dazzling display of feathered regalia, became the backdrop for betrayals that would later be recounted in hushed tones over campfires. The city's canals reflected the sunrise, turning the water into molten amber, a beautiful yet foreboding mirror of the empire's fate. As night fell, the drums of war began a low rumble, promising that the next act would be written in blood, fire, and the echo of a once great civilization's final sigh. When La Noche Triste turned the moonlit streets of Tenochtitlan into a watery grave, Cortés stared at the shattered hull of his ambitions and laughed, if you could call it a laugh, like a man who just realized he'd left his favorite taco at home. He rallied his ragtag band of conquistadors, brandishing swords that looked more like kitchen knives than war tools, and whispered promises of gold to his native allies, whose eyes glittered with both hope and the faint scent of incense. The Spaniards, still dripping with the stench of burnt flesh and river mud, swore an oath to return, their resolve as stubborn as a cactus in a desert storm. Around them, the city's towering temples loomed like giant neon signs advertising doom, and the distant drums of the Aztecs sounded like a bass line in an ancient, foreboding soundtrack. In that moment, the stage was set for a siege that would make even Game of Thrones look like a backyard squabble. Cortés ordered his men to turn the city's famed canals into a battlefield, swapping elegant reed boats for makeshift galleys, bristling with crossbows and Spanish bravado. The water, once a shimmering mirror of jade, now churned with the splintered hulls of captured canoes and the oily slick of spilled blood, a nauseating perfume that clung to every soldier's nostrils. Aztec warriors, draped in feathered armor, launched flaming projectiles that hissed like angry dragons, while the Spaniards retaliated with cannon blasts that rattled the very stones of the grand plazas. Nightfall brought a chorus of croaking frogs and the guttural war cries of both sides, echoing off stone walls as if the city itself were screaming in agony. The siege turned the canals into a chaotic dance floor where every splash could be a death cue, and the only thing louder than the clamor of battle was the collective gasp of onlookers watching history rewrite itself in water and fire. Amid the clamor, an invisible enemy slipped through the city's alleys like a silent thief, spreading a fever that turned warriors into trembling shadows. Smallpox, the dreaded Spanish gift, arrived on the breath of a single infected soldier, and quickly turned the proud Aztec ranks into a sea of coughing, fever-burned bodies that reeked of rot and desperation. Mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers that sounded like desperate karaoke verses, while the scent of incense mingled with the acrid tang of disease, creating a perfume no market vendor could ever hope to sell. The Spaniards, immune to the worst of the illness, watched with a mix of horror and grim satisfaction as their foes wilted like wilted flowers in a desert sun. The disease turned the siege into a macabre game of who can outlast the plague, and every cough became a drumbeat counting down to Tenochtitlan's inevitable collapse. Tension crackled through the air like static before a thunderstorm, and betrayal simmered like a pot left unattended on a fire. Some of Cortés's native allies, whose loyalty had been bought with promises of power, began to whisper doubts, their eyes flickering between the glitter of Spanish gold and the familiar glow of their own temples. One night, a stealthy Aztec scout slipped past the Spanish lines, only to be caught in a net of irony when he tripped over a stray conquistador's boot and fell into a mud pit that smelled of fermented corn. The Spaniards, ever the opportunists, turned the mishap into a morale-boosting tale, shouting, "Even the gods are slipping on our victory," while the city's inhabitants listened, their hearts pounding like drums in a horror movie soundtrack. As weeks bled into months, the once imperial city began to look less like a jewel and more like a battered ship taking on water, its once proud towers now sagging under the weight of death and despair. Cortés, perched on a battered wooden platform, surveyed the scene with a grin that could have been mistaken for a grimace, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of resistance. The final assault loomed like the climax of a blockbuster: explosions, sword clashes, and the inevitable dramatic pause before the curtain falls. When the first stone finally crumbled, it sounded like the final note of a tragic symphony, echoing through the canals and leaving the survivors with a lingering taste of iron and burnt maize. In that haunting silence, the fall of Tenochtitlan was sealed, a story that would be retold in taverns and textbooks alike, forever reminding us that even the greatest empires can be toppled by a mix of ambition, disease, and a splash of bad luck. In the sweltering June of 1521, the Spaniards rolled their iron thunder onto the lake, cannonballs screaming like a rock concert pyrotechnic show. Beside them, the Tlaxcalan warriors, fierce as a squad of street fighter gamers, slashed through the wooden causeways that linked the floating city to the mainland. The first cannon blast shattered the reeds, sending splinters and a cloud of mud into the air that smelled of boiled frog and fear. When the causeway gave way under the weight of horse and steel, it roared open like a busted dam, spilling warriors into the heart of Tenochtitlan. Even the Aztec trumpeters could barely muster a note over the clatter, as if the gods themselves had switched the soundtrack to heavy metal. The city, a maze of canals and stone, turned into a soggy battlefield where every step squelched like a rubber boot in a swamp. Aztec defenders, clutching obsidian blades that glittered like midnight knives, leapt from floating gardens, shouting curses that mingled with the acrid bite of gunpowder. Blood slicked the wooden decks, mixing with the sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine that the Spaniards tried to ignore. The Tlaxcalans, laughing at the chaos, hurled spears that sang through the air, each hit punctuated by a splash louder than a splash screen in a video game. All around, the lake churned with dead fish and debris, a putrid soup that clung to the skin and made every breath feel like swallowing seawater. Just as the metal clanged, an invisible enemy slipped into the camp, the tiny virus that would make the Aztecs wish they'd ordered a take-out pizza instead of fighting. Smallpox erupted on skin like a bad Tinder date, red, itchy rashes that blossomed overnight, covering warriors in a blanket of misery. The disease spread faster than gossip at a royal feast, turning proud warriors into trembling shadows that could barely stand over their own swords. Even the Spanish priests, who thought they were delivering salvation, watched in horrified awe as the empire's golden armor of health crumbled. The survivors whispered that the gods had swapped their usual fireworks for a plague, a twist as ironic as a Marvel hero turning villain on a whim. When the last defensive wall finally gave, the Spanish stormed the Grand Palace with the fervor of a binge-watching marathon, hungry for a finale. Flames licked the courtyards, turning marble columns into sizzling sticks that crackled like a summer bonfire on a beach. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, stood on the highest terrace, his eyes sharp as a hawk yet dimmed by the smoky haze of defeat. He fought like a lone Jedi against an empire of stormtroopers, blade against blade, until a Spanish sword found its mark and the great ruler fell. The palace doors slammed shut behind the invaders, echoing like the closing credits of an epic saga, while the once proud courtiers stared at the wreckage, bewildered as if they'd just watched their favorite TV series get canceled. The city lay in ruins, its canals clogged with the stench of burnt incense and the coppery tang of fresh blood, a smell that would haunt the conquerors for years. Cuauhtémoc's lifeless body was dragged to the central plaza, where the Spaniards staged a grim procession that felt like a low-budget reenactment of a coronation gone wrong. As the sun set behind the skeletal spires, the conquerors hoisted their flag, a ragged banner that fluttered like a tired superhero cape. In the distance, the surviving Aztecs whispered prayers, their voices a mournful chorus that rose above the crackling embers, a reminder that empires crumble faster than a sandcastle at high tide. History would later paint the fall as the ultimate clash of civilizations, but on that drenched night, it was just a mess of mud, metal, and the bitter aftertaste of victory. When the last stone of Tenochtitlan crumbled under the weight of Spanish boots, the conquistadors rolled out a carpet of red clay tiles and set up New Spain like a bad sequel to a reality TV show. The air tasted of ash, blood, and the sour tang of spilled chocolate, while the distant echo of cannon fire mixed with the mournful cries of surviving Aztecs. In the shadow of the shattered Templo Mayor, Hernán Cortés planted a wooden cross that sprouted a cathedral faster than a meme goes viral. The new streets were a jumbled mash-up of cobblestones and broken stone cutters' tools, each step kicking up dust that smelled like burnt incense and horse sweat. Even the river, once a glittering mirror for sunrise, now carried the stench of copper coins and the occasional discarded conquistador's bootlace. Spanish priests, armed with rosaries and a healthy dose of irony, turned the ruins into a chorus of chanting monks and squealing choir boys, their hymns drowning out the drum beats that once summoned warriors. They nailed golden idols to the altar, then painted over them with bright frescoes of saints, an early form of cultural Photoshop gone rogue. The locals, clutching their maize-filled stomachs, watched as their gods were swapped for saints who looked suspiciously like the Spanish officers who just trampled their temples. Markets that once smelled of roasted chilies now wafted with the aroma of pork carnitas and the occasional whiff of sacramental wine, a sensory mash-up that would make any foodie Instagrammer swoon. Yet beneath the Baroque facades, whispers of the old language slipped through the cracks like graffiti on a cathedral wall. History loves a good cautionary tale, and the fall of Tenochtitlan serves it up with a side of smallpox and hubris, like a tragic Netflix binge you can't stop watching. Disease rode the ships faster than any cavalry, turning the conquistadors' triumph into a macabre lottery, where the winners were often the very natives who survived the plagues. The empire-building swagger that once seemed unstoppable cracked under the weight of a cough and a fever, proving that no amount of steel can outmuscle a microscopic invader. Ironically, the very people who claimed to bring civilization ended up being the carriers of a civilization-ending pandemic. The story echoes today whenever a modern power thinks it can rewrite history without paying the hidden price of human suffering. Mexican memory clings to the ruins like a stubborn vine sprouting Day of the Dead altars beside colonial plazas, each sugar skull a wink at the past's absurdity. Children play hide and seek among the stone arches, their laughter bouncing off walls that have heard both war chants and wedding bells. The narrative of conquest is taught in classrooms with a mix of pride and embarrassment, like a family reunion where aunties compare recipes and also remind you of that awkward cousin who stole the spotlight. Street vendors hawk tacos al pastor next to souvenir stalls selling tiny conquistador helmets, a delicious irony that makes tourists grin and locals roll their eyes. Even the national anthem hums a line about the brave, while the ghost of an Aztec warrior watches from a balcony, sipping on a cold cerveza and shaking his head. Today, tourists snap selfies in front of the Cathedral of Mexico City, unaware they're posing on the exact spot where a stone altar once sang to the sun, turning their Instagram feeds into accidental time travel diaries. Hollywood loves the drama, churning out series that dramatize the clash with the subtlety of a fireworks show at a funeral. Think Game of Thrones meets Coco. Yet the real legacy lives in the streets. The scent of fresh corn tortillas mingling with the distant toll of church bells, the echo of ancient drums in modern reggaeton beats. Scholars argue over who won, while locals simply enjoy a good mole sauce and the freedom to laugh at the absurdity of history's grand theater. In the end, the aftermath of the conquest is a layered tapestry, gritty, glorious, and forever unfinished, just like the perfect taco that always needs a little more salsa. At dawn, the mist clung to the lake like a cheap fog machine at a low-budget sci-fi set, and Izzle waded through the cool, mud-slick water with a reed basket balanced on his shoulder. He hummed a tuneless version of a modern pop chorus, his feet squelching in the oozy silt that smelled of algae and fresh-cut reeds. The sun cracked open, scattering gold across the water, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed like a metronome. Dizzle paused at the edge where cattails swayed, his eyes catching a figure in a feathered cloak, a cattle, the priest-architect, who looked as solemn as a judge on a courtroom drama. The two exchanged a grin, the kind that says, "Let's mess with destiny and maybe grow some lettuce." AC Attle lifted a weather-worn codex, its pages fluttering like a nervous butterfly, and whispered about the ancient dream of Chinampas, floating gardens that could feed an empire the way a pizza delivery app feeds a college dorm. He described how the Aztecs would stitch together layers of mud, reeds, and compost, turning swampy chaos into ordered rows of corn that would stand taller than a skyscraper's lobby. Dizzle laughed, picturing a giant salad bar floating on water, and asked whether the gods required a subscription fee. A cattle's eyes twinkled, and he replied that the only tax was hard work and the occasional angry frog. The lake lapped at their boots, as if applauding the audacity of turning soggy ground into a banquet. Together they trekked to a shallow cove where the water barely kissed the mud, and Izzle began dragging bundles of cattail stems, their hollow tops popping like popcorn when the wind teased them. The cattle knelt, spreading a thin mat of reeds, then piled dark, nutrient-rich mud over it, the scent of earth rising like incense in a temple. They marked the first plot with a carved stone shaped like a jaguar, a nod to the city's fierce mascot, because who doesn't love a good mascot? As the sun swayed overhead, they sang a work chant that sounded suspiciously like a karaoke version of "We Will Rock You," their voices echoing off the water's surface. By sunset, a modest rectangle of fertile land floated defiantly, a green promise bobbing on the lake. But the lake was not a polite host. Mosquitoes swarmed like paparazzi, and a sudden splash of sour, rotting fish made Izzle gag, reminding him that agriculture sometimes smells like a dumpster fire. The cattle cursed the stubborn reeds that tangled his sandals, joking that they were auditioning for a reality show called Survivor, Swamp Edition. Yet each setback sparked a grin. After all, building a city on water was the ultimate irony, like trying to host a barbecue on a surfboard. They wrestled with waterlogged compost that oozed a slimy, sweet perfume, and Izzle slipped, landing face first into a puddle of mud that stuck to his beard like a bad haircut. Still, they pressed on, because every squelch and splash was a step toward feeding a million mouths. When the first seedlings broke through the dark crust, tiny green shoots trembling like newborn actors on opening night, Izzle felt a surge of pride that could rival a superhero's cape fluttering in the wind. The cattle declared the Chinampa a success, proclaiming that the city's future would rise from these floating farms, the way a blockbuster sequel builds on a cult classic. The lake reflected their triumph, glittering like a giant mirror ball at a rave, while distant drums beat a rhythm of celebration. Children gathered, their laughter bubbling up as they chased dragonflies that darted over the new garden, turning the scene into a living mural. And so, with each seed planted, the seeds of the city story sprouted, promising that Tenochtitlan would someday tower not just on stone, but on the very ingenuity of a farmer and a priest-architect daring to grow a metropolis on water. At dawn, Izzle whistled a rhythm that sounded like a drumbeat on a broken maraca, rallying her crew of sun-baked laborers. They hauled bundles of reeds, slick with lake slime, and tossed them into the shallow water like giant green noodles. With mud and lake soil layered between the reeds, the team pressed and bound the floating mats into sturdy islands, each one smelling of earth and fish guts. The sun baked the new land, turning the surface to a warm, cracked crust that crackled under their boots. By midday, the first chinampa rose like a green raft, promising a harvest as bold as a warrior's war paint. Just as the reeds settled, Chief Xochitl swaggered over, his feathered headdress flashing like a neon sign in the humid haze. "Faster, Izzle," he barked, demanding yields that could feed a whole city before the next rainstorm, as if crops grew on command like a video game power-up. Izzle met his glare with a wry smile, replying that even the gods needed time to stir the soil. The rivalry sparked a tense dance, each side tossing barbed jokes about who could coax corn from the mud first. The air thrummed with competition, the scent of ambition mixing with the earthy perfume of the lake. Soon the lake rose, spilling over the newly born islands with a roar that sounded like a giant swallowing its own tongue. Water rushed into the reed roots, turning the fresh mud into a squelchy, sour soup that stank of rotting algae. Laborers slipped on slick mud, their boots squelching like overripe grapes, while the chorus of frogs turned the scene into a swampy karaoke bar. Izzle shouted orders, her voice cutting through the flood like a machete, urging workers to stack sandbags and carve dikes with their bare hands. By nightfall, the islands stood defiantly against the flood, dripping with rainwater that glittered like spilled glitter on a costume party. Just when the water settled, a swarm of hungry insects descended, buzzing like a broken drone fleet intent on devouring every tender shoot. The pests left tiny bite marks on corn stalks that smelled of sour milk and burnt sugar, turning hopeful greens into a grotesque patchwork. Izzle's crew improvised, tossing crushed chilies into the canals, creating a spicy barrier that made the bugs cough and flee, as if they'd tasted ghost pepper hot sauce. Laughter erupted when a particularly plump beetle landed on a worker's nose, only to be flicked away like an unwanted pop-up ad. The battle with bugs became a rite of passage, each survivor earning a badge of honor made of dried corn husk. With the flood tamed and the pests chased away, the final challenge was the irrigation canals, a maze of watery arteries that had to whisper precisely to each chinampa. Izzle directed the diggers to carve channels as smooth as a vinyl record, their shovels clinking like percussion in a marching band. When the first trickle of water surged through the new canals, it sang a low, soothing hum that reminded the workers of a lullaby their mothers sang while weaving baskets. The canals fed the islands, coaxing corn, beans, and squash to sprout in perfect harmony, turning the swamp into a green tapestry worthy of a blockbuster fantasy epic. As the sun set, Izzle raised a cup of fermented cacao, toasting the team with a grin that said, "We've built a floating garden worthy of the gods, and a pretty decent Wi-Fi signal for the future." The sun-bleached reeds of the chinampas sway like a chorus of green flags, each floating garden now thick with stalks and leaves. A cattle, with a grin wider than a corn cob, walks the waterways pointing out where the soil is richest. He introduces crop rotation, swapping maize for beans and back again, like a culinary DJ remixing the same beat. The beans cling to the stalks, fixing nitrogen, while squash spreads its leafy carpet, keeping weeds at bay. By sunset, the air smells of damp earth and sweet corn, promising a bounty that could feed an army of hummingbirds. Next, a cattle pairs the trio in a perfect three-way dance. Maize offers a sturdy ladder, beans climb its ribs, and squash blankets the ground, a living mulch that shushes the sun. He scatters composted fish waste, slimy, pungent, and oddly satisfying, into the furrows, turning the water into a broth of nutrients. The scent is a potent mix of sea salt and rot, enough to make a city dweller gag, yet the chinampa beds drink it greedily. Children giggle as they chase dragonflies over the water, their laughter echoing like maracas at a fiesta. The harvest soon bursts with golden ears, ruby beans, and orange squash, each bite a reminder that even trash can taste like triumph. Just when the fields hum with prosperity, a sky-hungry drought rolls in, pulling the lake's surface down like a shy child hiding behind a curtain. The water channels that once sang with splashing reeds fall silent, and the chinampas begin to crack, exposing raw, sun-scorched mud. Dizzle watches the reeds curl, feeling the panic rise in his chest like a drumbeat before battle. The villagers whisper superstitions about angry gods, but Izzle knows the answer lies in engineering, not prayer. He gathers the elders, promising a solution that will make the drought wish it had brought a raincoat. With a swagger reminiscent of a superhero, assembling a gadget, Izzle sketches raised dikes from woven willow and mud, towering like tiny forts over the thirsty plots. He rigs rainwater catchments, bamboo funnels that channel each reluctant drop into underground cisterns, turning every patter into a hidden reservoir. The construction sounds like a percussion ensemble. Splintering wood, thudding mud, and the occasional splash of accidental overflow that drenches a surprised goat. By the time the first clouds gather, the dikes stand proud, and the cisterns glint like treasure chests under a stormy sky. Dizzle laughs, saying, "If the gods won't water us, we'll just build a DIY Amazon rainforest on a budget." The rains finally arrive, drumming on the newly raised walls, and the water rushes back into the chinampas with the enthusiasm of a Netflix binge. Crops drink greedily, their leaves unfurling like applause for the ingenuity of their caretakers. The community gathers for a feast, tossing corn kernels into the air like confetti while chanting a hymn that sounds suspiciously like a modern pop chorus. We will farm you," and everyone laughs. Izzle and a cattle stand at the water's edge, watching the reflected sunrise paint the sky in gold, proof that resilience can be cultivated as surely as maize. The chapter closes on the hum of insects, the scent of fresh soil, and the knowledge that even a drought can't starve a civilization that knows how to turn water into wheat. The sky cracked open like a broken drum, and a torrent of rain slammed the lake into a frothing beast. Waves rolled over the floating gardens, slapping the reed walls with a sound like 1,000 drums beating in unison. The scent of wet earth rose, mingling with the sour tang of algae, as the water surged toward the city's stone causeways. People stared in horror as the water lapped hungrily at the foot of the temples, and even the fierce war drums of the warriors seemed to falter under the roar of the storm. Dizzle, her hair slick with rain, barked orders that cut through the howling wind like a machete, while a cattle, stoic as a stone statue, gestured toward the chinampas with a clenched fist. They ordered the laborers to stack floating mats and bundles of reeds into makeshift dams, turning the gardens into a living barricade. The chinampas, those ancient floating farms, snapped into action, their channels becoming arteries that diverted the flood's fury away from the heart of Tenochtitlan. Water rushed through the engineered canals, spilling over into the surrounding marshes, while the city's core stayed dry, as if the very earth itself were holding its breath. The populace, drenched but undeterred, surged forward like a tide of determined ants, hauling baskets of corn and beans to reinforce the barriers. Children shouted jokes about mud pies, while older men grunted, slapping mud from their boots, their faces a mix of grime and fierce pride. The smell of wet maize and the earthy perfume of turned soil filled the air, a reminder that these gardens fed the empire and now defended it. Laughter cracked through the gloom as a fisherman tossed a soggy fish back into the water, exclaiming, "Even the fish are trying to escape the party." As the storm's rage began to wane, the water that had threatened to drown the city now glistened like a spilled potion of victory. Isil and a cattle stood on a raised platform, arms outstretched, shouting, "Avengers, assemble," a cheeky nod to the warriors of myth who always showed up just in time. The Chinampas, once humble agricultural plots, had become the city's shield, proving that ingenuity could outmuscle nature's tantrums. The crowd roared, their cheers echoing off the stone walls, turning the disaster into a spectacular triumph that would be sung for generations. When the clouds finally cleared, the sun broke through, casting golden shafts over the still glimmering water, and the city exhaled as one. The gardens, now sparkling with droplets, smelled sweetly of fresh corn and the faint perfume of rain-kissed lilies. Zizzle brushed a stray leaf from her shoulder and whispered, "We turned a flood into a festival," while a cattle chuckled, noting that the Chinampas had earned a new title, the ultimate floodgate. The tale of the flood of triumph spread beyond the lake's edge, a reminder that the Aztecs could ride the waves of danger with the same skill they cultivated their fields. The empire stood taller, its roots deeper, and its future, like its gardens, was forever anchored in water and will. When the last thunderclap faded, the lake-bound city of Tenochtitlan blinked back to life like a neon sign after a power outage. The storm-ripped reeds swayed, dripping water that glittered on the canals, and the wind finally surrendered its howl. Traders unfurled their colorful blankets, and the market squares swelled with crates of maize, beans, and chilies, as if the gods themselves had delivered a banquet. Children chased each other between stalls, their laughter ricocheting off stone walls, while the scent of fresh tortillas rose like a warm blanket over the crowd. The city, once bruised, now pulsed with a rhythm that could make even a stone statue tap its foot. The market smelled like a stew that had been simmering for centuries, earthy corn, smoky cacao, and the sharp bite of fresh lime that made noses tingle. Vendors shouted in a chorus of Nahuatl, their voices mixing with the splash of canoes and the clatter of wooden wheels on packed earth. A vendor named Cuatli tossed a handful of roasted squash seeds into the air, and they fell like confetti, crackling as they hit the hot sand. The air was thick with the sweet perfume of blooming marigolds, the sour tang of fermented pulque, and the occasional whiff of river mud that reminded everyone that they were still living on water. Even the flies seemed to have a sense of humor, buzzing around a stray piece of fried fish, as if auditioning for a reality TV show. Amid the bustle, Isil stood like a living legend, her hair now silvered but her eyes still sharp as obsidian blades. She had traded the vigor of youth for the weight of wisdom, and the younger apprentices gathered around her like moths to a flame. Listen close, she said, tapping a wooden board with a practiced hand, and you'll hear the lake whisper the secret of the Chinampa. Her voice carried the cadence of a storyteller who had survived droughts, wars, and a particularly nasty bout of mosquito-borne fever. The children lined in, their faces sticky with honey, eager to learn the art that had once saved the empire from starvation. Izel led the apprentices to a shallow lagoon where reeds rose like green skyscrapers, then showed them how to weave a lattice of willow branches, chanting a rhyme that sounded suspiciously like a rap battle between a jaguar and a corn cob. They piled mud, compost, and a splash of lake water into the woven frame, watching it settle with a squelch that felt oddly satisfying, like stepping on a giant, juicy grape. As the sun baked the fresh beds, tiny insects emerged, buzzing in a chorus that could rival any pop concert, while a stray otter slipped by, stealing a stray ear of corn with a cheeky grin. The apprentices laughed, their hands coated in mud that smelled of earthy perfume and a hint of fish, realizing that building a floating garden was part engineering, part dance, and part comedy show. By sunset, the new Chinampa floated proudly, a green raft ready to feed generations, and Izel winked, saying, "Now you've got a garden that can survive a flood and a Netflix binge alike." As night draped its velvet over the city, lanterns flickered on the canals, casting golden ripples that turned the water into liquid amber. Izel gathered the apprentices one last time, her voice soft but resonant, reminding them that the Chinampa was more than a plot of land. It was a promise that ingenuity could turn even the most hostile environment into a banquet. She spoke of the ancient turtles that once carried the city on their backs, and how the floating gardens were the modern equivalent, keeping Tenochtitlan buoyant and bountiful. The youngsters felt the weight of history settle on their shoulders, but also a spark of excitement, like discovering a cheat code for a video game they thought was impossible to beat. With a final chuckle, Izel declared, "Go forth and feed the empire, and remember, if you can survive a storm and a mosquito apocalypse, you can handle anything, even a Monday."